Story number one. If I'm honest, there was nothing unusual about that Friday night party. The food was average, the beer was just cold enough, and friends' laughter hung thick in the room's humid air. It was already past midnight, and everyone else seemed determined to squeeze more joy out of the evening than it could possibly hold. Nothing compelled me to stay, so after a few polite nods, I slipped out, eager for the familiar hush of the road. The highway home always felt like a quiet reprieve, interrupted only by the occasional passing headlights and the soft hum of my aging sedan. My mind wandered, replaying old songs from the stereo, distant in the background. That's when I noticed the light ahead. At first, a faint white glow, like another car approaching from the opposite direction. I waited for high beams to resolve into form, but instead the glow grew to a dreadful intensity, blinding and cold, flooding every corner of my car's interior. No horn, no screech of another vehicle, just a sudden wash of light so violent I instinctively jerked the wheel, certain I was about to crash. There was a thud, a hollow impact, then nothing. I opened my eyes to silence. I could still hear my own breathing, shallow and ragged. The first thing I registered was the stillness, and then the realization that I was no longer on any road I recognized. My car idled in a clearing, but the trees surrounding me were strange. Towering black trunks contorted by fire at their bases, their upper branches reaching out like the fingers of blind men. The air smelled of burnt soil and old ash, and yet the ground as I stepped out wasn't soft or crumbling, but dry, packed hard with deep fissures running in unnatural geometric patterns. It was colder than it should have been for that time of year, a damp chill that crept inside my shirt. My headlights illuminated a sight even more improbable. A dark patch, easily 40 feet across, etched into the scarred earth like a wound. At its center, there gaped a perfectly round hole, wider than any well or animal den, so dark that it swallowed the beams of my headlights whole. I picked up a branch and tossed it in. I never heard it hit the bottom. Nothing about the place felt right. There shouldn't be woods anywhere near my neighborhood. I knew these roads, these landscapes too well. I turned back and found no sign of the path that should have led me home. Just more trees shuddering in a wind I couldn't feel. Then came the scream. Shrill, not high-pitched like a child's or an injured animal's, but somehow deeper, as if echoing up from the earth itself. Though there was no breeze, the trees shifted, their leaves trembling as something darted between the trunks. Whatever it was, I could not catch its shape, always just out of focus, moving too quickly, trailing a faint scent, like copper and damp moss. I wanted to run, and yet the woods formed a kind of maze, every direction leading me back to that black patch, my footsteps falling in the same prints again and again. I tried retracing my route to the car, only to find it parked in increasingly peculiar spots, as if someone kept moving it when I blinked. My phone was dead. The numbers on my dashboard clock flickered in erratic patterns before fading to black. The next thing I clearly remember was the road reappearing all around me, the familiar avenue, streetlights flickering in orange arcs. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. There was music playing from the radio, but it was just a staticky drone, utterly unfamiliar. The sensation was as though I had just woken up from a deep sleep. My memory of the woods gaped with blankness. At home, my dreams stank of burning wood, shrilling voices, and a shape with jointless arms. I woke breathless, my sheets twisted and damp. It was only when I went to work that I learned something was wrong. Colleagues avoided my gaze, glancing at each other before telling me I'd been speaking in panicked bursts, or not at all. I'd apparently spent long moments frozen, unblinking, after which I would mutter in some nonsensical tongue no one could recognize. Even my boss, not known for empathy, asked if I needed help. I remembered none of this. I didn't recall standing with my back rigid by the water cooler, my eyes tracking things that weren't there. On the way home, a hush fell again over the car. The air grew heavy, dense enough that breathing became effort. At a stoplight, I glimpsed movement in the rearview mirror. Something pale, a silhouette, at first barely visible, like a stain growing on the seat behind me. It resolved into a creature impossibly tall, even seated, its limbs thin and segmented like branches. Black eyes, faceless and yet consuming, peered through my reflection. I tried to move, to scream, but I couldn't. It felt as if someone had pressed a remote control and jammed the world into pause. My pulse thudded, my body frozen. The thing leaned forward, its movements broken and flickering, as if reality itself shuddered around it. I felt its ice-cold limbs encircle my wrist, pinching with a pressure so intense my vision swam. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't scream. It was as if my voice had been stolen. In my ear it made a sound, neither word nor growl, but a scraping, sibilant whisper that vibrated against my skull, dissolving in my mind like acid. Then it was gone. The car was empty. My chest released, breath bursting out of my mouth, but on my wrist where it had grabbed me, a deep red imprint remained, shaped like nothing human or animal. I washed my hands until the skin turned raw, but the mark stayed, angry and dark, impossible to scrub away. Months passed, but the disturbing events didn't cease. Sometimes I'd be in line at a store or stir my coffee at work when suddenly a film would drop over the world. My mind would go heavy, my limbs locked in half motion. People around me said I would stand as if suspended, unable to answer or move, lost somewhere unseen. When the control returned, I'd find my heart racing, sweat beating my neck, but no memory of what had just transpired. I tell myself it's some trick. Stress, a mini stroke, sleep deprivation, or an undiagnosed neurological tic. I want to believe it's possible to explain everything. The woods a half-dream, my mental state a fluke of fatigue. But sometimes when the silence grows thick or shadows pool in the corners, I still feel a presence just out of sight, watching, waiting to press pause once again. And the mark on my wrist never fades. Story number 2. I never had much ambition about life, and most mornings the world seemed gray and bland. That was why the apartment seemed like a good idea. Cheap, close enough to college, and quiet, with nothing promising to disturb my studies. Looking back, I realize now that some places wear their history like a hidden smell. Sour, old, and stubborn. But at the time, it was just 4 walls, a ceiling, and my own breath echoing at night. I hardly noticed the cold seep under the door, or the way the light sometimes flickered for no reason. I suppose you only notice these things in hindsight, when you're trying to convince yourself that you should have known. It must have been my 6th or 7th week in that place. The days ran together, the nights more so. I remember waking up from a strangled dream, the sort where you feel trapped but can't remember why. It was full dark, the only light coming from the window. The city outside must have been asleep. The air felt thick, muffled, as if the building was a sealed jar. I heard a scrape, a wet, dragging sound as if someone was shuffling their feet through sawdust. My heart surged so suddenly I pressed a fist to my chest, willing it to quiet down. I lay there listening, not moving, until there was a crash, a sharp, crystalline clatter, like someone had thrown a glass against the wall. My eyes snapped to the far end of the room, where the moon cast a pale reflection on the only mirror, a long, thin piece I bought for less than 20 rupees at a thrift shop near campus. I saw a hairline crack furling out, almost like a spiderweb, glinting strangely in the muted light. That alone should have unnerved me, but I was more annoyed than scared, and my neck hurt from the abruptness with which I awoke. I shuffled over, bare feet cold against the floor, and placed my palm against the crack. The glass was icy, the chill leaking through my skin. I pressed harder, blinking against the urge to yawn, and all at once the world turned inside out. There wasn't a sense of movement, not really. It felt as if everything inside me sucked forward, bones and heartbeat and memory, sucked through a straw too small for my body. The room spun around itself, walls bowing in and out like they were breathing. I stumbled forward, half falling, and suddenly the hushed, stale air was gone, replaced by something thicker, heavier, almost syrupy. I was still standing, but the room wasn't right. The color was off, washed out gray, with every surface coated in a faint dust. The mirror floated behind me, or maybe I was inside it, gazing out through the rift I'd left. Where my narrow bed used to be, there was something else, something that looked like a bed, but the sheets were crusted dark yellow, bunched at the corners, and the mattress caved in the middle. Around it, plates and bowls sat on the floor, some half filled with food so molded and ruined that it was little more than black-green blobs. The smell hit first, a deep, sour rot, so strong my eyes watered. At first I thought it was some trick, a hallucination from fever or food poisoning maybe, so I did all the sensible things. I pinched myself. I screamed, but the noise came back flat and muffled. like yelling through cotton. I went for the door, but there was none. And the window wasn't there either, just a pale rectangle where the world should be. When I pressed against the wall, it was soft and resistant, as if it might give way, but only if I pressed hard enough. I didn't. I tried to keep track of time. Maybe hours passed, maybe longer. One night, if it was a night, the room dimmed so low that the corners dissolved into inky nothing. Each time I drifted off, I snapped awake with a jolt, certain something was brushing against my cheek. One time I felt breath flutter over my mouth, as cold as the grave. Another I woke to an echoing rasp, almost like a dead bird trapped in the walls, wings tapping feebly. Every so often something hovered above me as I lay curled up on the decayed bed. When I dared to peek, it stood barely outlined in the semi-dark, a distorted patch of blackness with edges that ran and blurred. I tried to focus, but every instinct forced me to squeeze my eyes shut. It was worse when I heard it move, skittering softly, as though it had more than one limb. Sometimes there was a sucking noise, deep and gurgling, and the stench grew so strong I retched until my throat burned. The only constants were hunger and dread. The rotten food tempted me, but the mere texture of it set my nerves jangling. It was as if I lived in a parody of my own life, an endless loop of rotten days. I counted the cracks on the wall, the molted stains on the ceiling, the uneven ripples in the glass behind me. My beard thickened, my skin flaked off in dry patches. I no longer recognized my hands, as if they were swelling and shrinking in erratic pulses. Time folded itself. Sometimes, relentlessly, the scenery shifted. I would turn to find the bed pressed closer, the shadows clustered thick around the floor. The hovering silhouette sometimes multiplied, twitching softly at the edges of my sight. At other moments, the room simply hummed, a low, persistent vibration that tickled my bones and set my teeth on edge. I watched my own reflection in the far wall, only it wasn't mine. It smiled back sometimes. Then, as suddenly as I'd entered, I awoke. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in short bursts, just as it had that first night. Everything was the same scratchy blanket, same dim light. The mirror was back in its place, smooth and flawless, as though it had never cracked. My hands were clean, no beard, and my skin as pale as before. My first impulse was to retaliate. I tore the mirror from the wall and dashed it to the ground. It shattered cleanly, scattering small, jagged shards across the floor. I tried to find the rotten bed, the ruined dishes, anything. All I saw was plaster and wooden boards. Later, my friends stopped by and told me they'd tried to check on me over the past 2 years, but I'd vanished. They said it as if it were a joke, but their eyes flickered elsewhere, like they didn't fully believe it. When I told them about the mirror, they exchanged glances and told me there was never a mirror in my room, that I must have been dreaming or hallucinating from stress. But I remembered every detail, the hovering black shape, the burnt rot in my lungs, the sensation of suffocating gloom. I moved back in with my parents. I couldn't sleep in a room with mirrors, not anymore. My reflection sometimes twitches, moves a fraction out of sync. Sometimes in the corner of my eye, I catch a slumping figure behind me, always out of focus. I tell myself it's nothing, just tricks of the light, the aftermath of isolation, maybe a seizure, maybe worse. I try not to think about it, but deep down I know some cracks don't ever fully disappear. Story number 3. I spend most mornings in the quiet grip of pre-dawn, the sky still an unreadable slate, even in summer, and the world out my window shrunk to the pull of my high beams over empty Route 94. I'm not easily spooked anymore. Years of teaching have given me a skepticism that borders on stubbornness. By 4:30 a.m., I'm caffeinated enough to believe I occupy a universe of reason and routine. Nearly a year ago, I rounded a gentle curve hemmed in by woods, the same stretch I sail every morning where wild grapevines turn to shadows and everything else is black. That day the air was dense, not quite foggy, but thick with the aftertaste of humidity. The only lights, aside from my own, hit me by surprise. 3 cars huddled oddly on the 2-lane, hazards blinking in unison. Their symmetry was unnerving, almost staged. No slumping hoods or drivers waving, just each vehicle spaced perfectly in line, as if measured. And this wasn't a busy route at any hour, let alone before dawn. I slowed, uncertain, expecting to see deer or some crash. But the cars themselves seemed content to wait, quietly flashing orange. Then so suddenly that it felt choreographed, every light, brake, hazard, dash, went black. My headlights caught only their windshields, reflecting my confusion. At that same instant, what had been quiet, fuzzy NPR murmuring from my radio detonated into an avalanche of static, so loud it rattled change in my cup holder. My Bluetooth, normally seamless, blinked and disappeared, leaving only trap-jawed, hungry white noise buzzing behind my eyes. I found myself rolling the car nearly to a stop, hand halfway to my phone, before I remembered that cell coverage here was spotty at best. I reached to turn the volume down, tried to make some sense of it all, scanning for movement. Did someone need help? But the doors on all three cars stayed closed. That's when I caught them. Shapes emerging from the woods, backs lit by faint, dying moonlight. 4, maybe 5 figures, tall enough to cast shadows that tangled in the headlight beams. Not quite right, even in silhouette. Their shoulders bent low, frames too long or limbs jointed oddly, moving with a scuttling, almost spider-like jerkiness. I rationalized at first. Maybe it was just adrenaline and the refraction through misted glass. But I remember the way they loped, not walked, as if every step troubled them or the ground resisted. Their shapes split the road with darkness as they approached the line of cars. No one called out, no engines restarted. The only sound was the relentless crunching of dry leaves underfoot, a noise so sharp and absolute I felt my teeth ache. It threatened to drown out even the radio's hissing. My fight or flight was muted by raw disbelief. I simply sat there, foot on the brake, the landscape of the familiar bent into something unrecognizable. It was as if the world was pausing, unwilling or unable to intercede. I said a little prayer, brief, embarrassing, but automatic. A rational mind would shout for me to snap a photo, but I couldn't move. Then I blinked, hard, as if the act might rub the sleep out of my vision. But when I opened my eyes, they were gone. Not just the misshapen figures, but the cars as well. Vanished in a way that felt like film spliced out of a reel. No broken glass, no tire marks, nothing. The hazard light glow had left a ghost impression behind my eyelids. But otherwise, only the humming, pox stripe of the blacktop showed itself, glistening with dew. The forest remained undisturbed. I sat in my idling car, radio still vomiting static, the dashboard clock frozen at 4:49. No vehicles, no bodies, no evidence that any of it had existed. Logic struggled with me. Maybe there had been a crash, and everyone cleared it swiftly when I looked away for a second. Maybe I had dozed and micro-dreamed the whole thing, lulled by exhaustion. My hands, however, wouldn't stop trembling. I drove on with stiff fingers and the sense that something was pacing my car just out of sight. 6 hours later, I parked during lunch and tried to turn on my radio. It was still dead, unresponsive, silent, as though some wire had been clipped. The Bluetooth reconnected that afternoon, as if nothing was ever wrong. I expected to hear about an accident on local news, or at least to catch whispers among the teachers' lounge about some strange roadblock or wild animal sighting. Nothing. No police mention, no snapped tree limbs or roadside debris. My husband, when I told him, said it was probably just fog and adrenaline, which sounded rational until I remembered the sequence. The synchronized lights, the motionless procession, the abrupt vanishing. A week later, perhaps against better judgment, I drove that stretch in daylight. It all looked so banal, just road and thicket, shoulder rutted with the imprints of utility trucks and passing deer. I would have dismissed it entirely if not for the tracks just past the bend, pressed into the thick mud where the woods opened up. They weren't like any animal prints I recognized. Long, three-toed, sunk deep as if the owner had carried impossible weight. The spacing was uneven, as if a person with uneven legs or multiple joints had walked there. I stooped, snapping a picture on my phone. There was no litter, no broken glass, nothing else to suggest human presence. A set of ordinary tire tracks faded nearby, but the mud seemed otherwise untouched. Over time, the details of that morning blur. Sometimes I remember 4 cars, not 3. Sometimes the figures' heads seemed too round, missing faces entirely. When I confessed my story, no matter how bluntly I state it, people grin awkwardly or change the subject. Even I wonder if it wasn't all a waking dream, the mind's trick under pressure. Perhaps the static was a fluke, a radio tower glitch. Maybe the prints were the work of a prankster, someone with carved plywood boots to frighten the unwary. And yet, every now and then, I wake at 4:30 with the taste of dry leaves in my mouth, the memory of headlights blinking out one after another. I've trained myself not to slow for hazards anymore on that road, No matter how organized, no matter how precise. I haven't seen anything since. No lights or shapes or prints. Still, when I press the hunt button on my dashboard, my radio hisses sometimes. Not music, not voice. Just cold, spitting static. As if something wants to remind me that not all things vanish in the daylight. I try to explain it away, like any sensible person would, but the unease never leaves. It just waits, silent, just out of reach. Story number 4. I take the night shifts because I like the quiet, less traffic, fewer gawkers, just me and the drone of diesel on the open county roads. Out here, where the fields run flat and gleam yellow under the sodium lamps, the world thins out in a way that's honest. Every so often, though, the dark cracks and lets something else blink through. Marker 23 is only a little green and white sign bolted to a concrete post, barely above the waist. It's just numbers and chipped paint. Everyone on the county crew knows about it, though. They'll laugh, make spooky ghost jokes over vending machine coffee, but no one hangs around that marker if they don't absolutely have to. I thought it was the old farmhouses, abandoned and half-sunk behind thick woods, playing tricks in the night. That's what I told myself. 3 weeks ago, somewhere around 2 in the morning, the dispatcher said there was a sign down at marker 23. Wind had banged it off, probably. Maybe some joyriding kid with a bat. Fog squatted low on the fields, heavy and weirdly dense, the way it sometimes does in late autumn. I didn't think much of it, just muttered about damp jeans and grabbed my reflective vest. The fog thickened as I drove, halos blooming around the truck's headlights. It rolled and churned, hypnotic to stare at, and there was this sucked-out silence. Like even the crickets and fence post owls had gone slack. My GPS pinged off and on. Cheap wiring, I figured. The county never budgeted for better. At marker 23, I found the sign guttered in the mud. The post snapped clean off. I knelt and set to work, wrench in hand, shoulders hunched against the mist. My breath felt trapped in my mask. Somewhere to my left, across the flat field, something large shuffled in the gloom. The shape hulking in the fog looked at first like a deer or a stray cow steamed out of a broken fence, broad and hunched, legs placed wrong, the sort of wildlife you see sometimes on empty nights. I wasn't alarmed, not yet, until it stopped, dead still, right at the edge of my high beams. I flicked the headlights brighter, blinking through the drizzle. The fog swirled. Where the animal stood, a woman resolved, hair curled up neat under a scarf, skirt patterned in squares like old wallpaper, handbag and gloves. She glowed flat, one hand holding her clutch, eyes too wide in her pale face, as though someone had thrown a projector's beam through a static channel and onto empty air. My stomach dropped out of me. For the longest second, the scene shuddered as if stuck on a broken film reel. She lifted her arm, wrist bent delicately, skin white as bone, and pointed past my shoulder. Just then, my truck's lights flickered, snapped off, and on again. Everything black for the space of a single heartbeat. When the beams came back, she was gone. I stood there, wrench shaking in my hand, cold sweat soaking the inside of my jacket. The mud at my boots was unmarked. I spun around trying to see what she'd been pointing at. The field rolled away, empty, only the long, hunched shadow of the derelict farmhouse behind a curtain of fog. There was nothing but wet grass and the glint of water pooling in ruts. A few fence posts caught by the distant glow of the highway. No movement, no sound. The air pressed in, thick and sour, every muffled sound foreign and wrong. My own breathing seemed too loud in my ears. I stood rigid for minutes, trying to listen for anything out of place, never sure if I wanted to hear footsteps and voices or wanted only silence. The damp earth felt too soft, and something in the air behind me prickled like static. I finished bolting the sign into place with jerky, hurried movements, lips numb. Back in the truck, the GPS was dead, just vertical green lines and lines of gibberish symbols. My phone spun through the searching era screen. I drove slower than I needed to, eyes on the rearview mirror. Every time the fog bunched up in my lights, I swore I saw part of a skirt flicker at the very edge. Just for a second. Gone when I looked directly. A dead rabbit appeared on the roadside half a mile down. Neck bent, no blood, just steam rising from the fur. The temperature inside the cab seemed to drop, condensation fogging my windows from the inside. The radio spat out a burst of static, then the faint, wrong echo of an old song. Could have been from the 50s, could have been just interference. By the time I hit the city limits, it was like nothing had happened. I filed the incident, like protocol said, time, location, description of the disturbance. I wrote it flat, matter of fact, omitting the detail about the dead rabbit, leaving out the static song. Administration chalked it up to exhaustion, night shift delusions, probable sleep deprivation. Can't deny lack of sleep makes the mind do odd things. My blood sugar was probably out of whack. Maybe there's a power line crossing out there, leaking just enough electromagnetic weirdness to scramble my brain. Maybe the GPS dying and the radio static are just side effects of a bad battery, patched wires, morning mist. But the memory won't smooth out, no matter how I press it flat. Sometimes when I'm driving the route, I'll catch a flash of checkered fabric where no one should be, a pale hand curling at the edge of the beams. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that sticks if you look away quick enough. The night air always gets dampest at marker 23, heavier than anywhere else along the county stretch. Twice since then, the GPS has shorted out again, exactly at the same spot. One time as I passed the marker, the scent of some old sweet perfume, vanilla and violets, powdery and thick, flooded the cab. Not flowers from the field, not wild onion, something half-remembered from a dead grandmother's dresser. Everyone else still jokes about marker 23, half-hearted now. I only go if I can't beg out, and when I do, I drive through at speed, doors locked, eyes forward. There are no more down signs, not since that night. No more stray cows either. Rational minds can line up their reasons. A trick of the headlamps in thick fog, a mirage formed from my own fatigue, some underground water messing with the electronics. I tell myself more often than not that they're right. They must be. The mind at 2 a.m. on a back road will spin shapes out of shadows, borrow faces from old photos, desperate to make sense of emptiness. But every night when I suit up for work, I check the call log, scan the routes, and hope to hell there's nothing at marker 23. And always in the back of my head is her hand lifting, a gesture caught mid-frame, pointing over my shoulder at something I cannot see, something I hope never moves close enough for me to understand. Story number 5. I had just turned 32 that spring, restless and stuck in the usual city shuffle. Somehow my boyfriend David convinced me to try what he called real stargazing, meaning a night in the Nevada desert. He was the kind of man who loved wild spaces. He'd talk about getting away from it all, as if the city were a noise he could switch off. I was city-born and bred, skeptical of bugs and silence, embarrassingly new to tents and anything without plumbing. Still, it was his birthday weekend, so I agreed. The sky out there was too big. Without buildings hemming me in, I felt sodden and exposed, like something small animals watched. We drove for hours, exchanged the yellow haze of Vegas for a cold, bitten emptiness. We parked miles from anywhere, laid down a borrowed tent behind a rocky outcrop, rolled out borrowed sleeping bags, put the telescope on a rickety tripod, and watched the sky. I remember being awed by how much more black there was between the stars, how they seemed to crowd each other, sharp and cold and impossible to touch. That first evening was nothing, just cold wind, the dry taste of sand, and David's excitement on my shoulder, pointing at shapes I'd never remember. At midnight, I squirmed in my sleeping bag, feeling pebbles press my hip. David barely moved. The inside of the tent smelled synthetic and a little musty, and I fell asleep to the flapping sound of nylon walls. Then sudden wakefulness. I remember only the star noise, that particular silence where you're so far from people that even the wind sounds unfamiliar. My back was pressed into gritty earth, and the world tilted. I wasn't in the tent. Instead, the entire sky spun above me. I lay flat, arms askew, eyes locked on stars spiraling in and out of focus, almost as if I was falling upward into them. I was shivering. The sand was cold. A faint electric tang seemed to hover at the back of my tongue, something like blood but sharper. For a moment I thought I was paralyzed. Then I turned my neck and saw the tent zipped shut as we'd left it. The light inside told me David was still there, sleeping, his bundle-shaped shadow rising and falling as he snored. I stood, legs shaky, and nearly tripped over my own feet. It was only then I noticed that my sweatshirt was on backwards, bunching uncomfortably at my throat, and my underwear was twisted, seams biting at my skin, my jeans buttoned awkwardly in back. The air was frigid, and I had nothing on my feet. My shoes were gone. So was my phone, which I'd left in one of the side pockets, so I could use it as a flashlight. I stumbled barefoot over jagged stones and found my way back to the tent, my body uncooperative. When I unzipped the flap, David didn't stir. I crawled past him, and the synthetic bag crinkled loud in the hush. I curled up wordless, wondering if I'd sleepwalked, but nothing about movement or the way my clothes hung backwards felt right. The pain arrived before dawn, a searing ache deep in my thigh. When I checked, there was a patch just above my right knee. Later, in the bathroom glare of a gas station, I saw it more clearly. Glaring geometric rash, precise as a tattoo. Perfect triangles, some small as pencil erasers, others as wide as a quarter, all scattered among crimson hexagons. The skin was hot and swollen, almost swelling out through the fabric. In the mirror, for a wild instant, I thought those shapes glowed, faint as static. By noon, they'd faded to a dull red, like a sunburn with a stenciled pattern. We searched for my shoes and phone in the daylight, combing sandy hillocks and tufts of dry grass. Nothing. David said maybe coyotes took my shoes, that the area was full of odd desert rodents. He suggested spiders for the rash, some rare species maybe. When we got back to the city, the doctor shrugged, said contact dermatitis and allergic skin reaction, prescribed a bland ointment that smelled of menthol. The nurse prodded and measured the triangles, asked about new detergents, unfamiliar plants, tick bites. I lied, said I didn't remember anything strange. For 3 nights afterward, I slept badly, but when I lay down, a strange humming buzzed up and down my bones, all in the right thigh, just below the rash. Electric worms, I thought, irrationally. Each night, as I floated on the edge of sleep, a gentle vibration throbbed under the skin, starting at the rash and racing through my leg to my hip. Nothing visible on the surface, just this deep fizz like touching old batteries to my tongue as a child. The dreams started that week. Sometimes I would see bones, my own, oddly luminous through translucent flesh, lit up by cold blue lights. Sometimes the blue light was inside my skull, shining out through my teeth and fingernails, and I'd wake up biting my tongue so hard it bled. The dreams were always silent, color-drained, yet so vivid I woke gasping. David and my friends wanted to go camping again. I refused, offered up the rash as an excuse. Even now, I wonder if that was just the city girl in me talking. Still, each time I even think about desert air, there's a taste of metal at the back of my mouth. I don't like silence anymore. That might have been enough to write it off as one weird night, until my skin betrayed me again. 1 year to the day later, just past midnight, I woke in my apartment shivering and nauseated. I threw back the sheets and there it was. The same geometric rash, triangles and hexagons painted in burning, angry red on my right thigh. No walk in the desert, no new shoes, no detergent. This time it stung as if acid fizzed just under my skin, so intense I nearly called an ambulance. Then, as before, it faded mid-morning, leaving the skin unblemished. It hasn't stopped. Every year, same date and time, that rash returns for a single night. Sometimes in the darkness, out of the corner of my eye, the shapes seem to flicker faintly, like bioluminescence in tide pools before resolving back to plain, feverish red in the bathroom light. Doctors don't offer new explanations. One suggested an allergy connected to a memory. The sleep specialist blamed sleepwalking, unconscious stress manifesting physiologically. An old friend joked that maybe I had been abducted, that the blue lights in my dreams were more than dreams, but there's always a rational answer. Contact reactions, psychosomatic skin responses, some undiagnosed autoimmune thing. I try to choose the explanation that lets me sleep. I don't sleep well anymore. Sometimes late at night, the vibrations return in my thigh, a warning I can't interpret. Sometimes, when the room is completely dark and my eyes adjust, it seems as if faint blue traces crawl just below my skin. I haven't camped again. David's long gone. Every June, as the anniversary approaches, I tell myself it was just a desert hallucination. No more real than bad dreams or stress. But in those quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the city itself feels hollow and strange, I remember the sky spinning above me and a humming that's never quite left my bones. I remind myself there's likely an answer, but it's never quite the right one. Story number 6. I grew up near the Gulf, where the horizon is always smeared with the possibility of a storm and the brine stings your skin raw. Night diving was never a big deal to me. I trusted the sea, or at least thought I understood its moods. If anything, the dark water felt like a familiar room at night. You knew where everything was, even if you couldn't see it. Last August, the humidity pressed down so thick I couldn't stay indoors. The air inside my house felt heavy, sighing through vent fans with every breath I took, but the promise of cool open water was always a relief. I set off alone, which I'd done maybe 100 times before. The dock at dusk was empty, except for the hush of insects starting up their night symphony, their clicking legs hidden somewhere unseen. I remember thinking, this is it, my own little world for an hour. The water was flat, mirrors except for the pulse of my boat's engine as I cruised a little offshore, where I like to drop into the cool. No other boats, not even a distant halo of porch lights from the cottages. I was completely alone. I suited up, checked the gauge, tested my lights, descended, and let the water swallow up the sound of everything except the bubbles lifting up past my ears. In the first few minutes, everything was familiar. Fish in their nighttime torpor, the slow waft of kelp brushing my hands, sand stirring beneath my flippers. I traced my usual route out, letting the layers of salt and shadow settle around me until I was just another slow-moving shape down there. That was when I noticed the bubbles. It was little at first, columns of them, each plume rising perfect and narrow in the drift, like the exhale of some hidden diver. But when I turned, they would always shift, never out front, always behind me, in a triangle that seemed to reorient as I moved. I checked my gear, pulling my light in close, the harsh white beam swallowing patterns of eelgrass and small startled fish. Nothing out of order. Still, the columns kept appearing. I swam in a wide circle to test a hunch, holding perfectly still. And again, as soon as I started forward, I'd see them just at the fringes of vision. Always behind. 3 columns, space so exact you could draw a line between their shimmering spines. Something about their perfection made my scalp crawl, despite the layers of rubber tight against it. The bubbles didn't move from the sand, not like debris from a crack or vent, which would billow out and drift. Instead, they seemed to wait, holding their place as I turned, as if marking something I couldn't see. It was colder near them, even through the wetsuit, pins and needles running down my sides, an ache blooming at the base of my skull. I must have been down longer than I knew, because my dive computer startled me with a sharp, abrupt beep. In the halo of the light, the numbers blinked. 2 a.m., or was it 2 minutes past the hour? But I checked again. I'd been under for nearly 30 minutes on a fresh tank, one that should have lasted almost twice that. Worse, I couldn't remember moving out to the second buoy, where I now hovered. There was a blank 30 minutes of unaccounted for time. Just the memory before, and now with nothing in between except the pulsing ache in my head. My stomach knotted up. I twisted to scan the water behind me, searching for anything that might explain the stillness, but my guts told me to surface. I'd seen enough. Breaking water felt like crossing into a separate reality. The boat, cast in strange moonlight, bobbed in perfect silence. Even the insects had gone quiet. My hands slipped on the rungs, scrambling up, adrenaline making my arms weak and useless. I could taste blood in my nose, sharp, metallic, running salty down my upper lip. I'd never had a nosebleed in my life, not even as a child. My wetsuit pinched. I shucked my hood and found, tangled with strands of my hair, tiny blue flecks that caught the light. Glass. Glass shattered into slivers, some even pressed into little crescent moons or star shapes that left faint red marks along my neck and collarbone. They glowed with a deep blue shimmer, like the heart of a flame, flecked with silver. I brushed more out from inside my suit. Some pieces left faint scratches on my skin that stung like the aftermath of a jellyfish. When I held them up, they caught the moon, etched with marks like writing, runic, not any script I recognized. Later, safe at home, I tried to piece together a story for myself. How had glass gotten into my hood, pressed into my hair and along my back where my suit was skin tight? If it had been the sand, the glass would be scoured smooth. These were sharp as needles, and their shapes, intentionally worked, almost decorative, didn't fit with anything I'd ever picked up off the Gulf. The runes were the most unsettling, never repeating, not quite accidental scratches, not quite purposeful. I asked my friend, who'd been out collecting driftwood the night before, a guy who could identify every shorebird by voice and knew every kind of stone the Gulf could cough up. He squinted at the blue glass chips and said, "Perhaps volcanic glass sometimes washes up," though he sounded unconvinced even as he offered that explanation. He frowned, tracing the runes, and added, in a low, uncertain voice, that they shouldn't show up in that pattern, or here, not on our scruffy beach or embedded tight in a diver's hair. He offered a dozen rational explanations. Underwater seismic activity, faulty gear, maybe I dozed off and brushed against a broken bottle, even if that bottle was nowhere to be found and none of the glass pieces fit together. I nodded along, but I threw out my wetsuit anyway, just in case something lingered in the seams that I couldn't scrub away. Sleep came in bursts over the next few nights, always interrupted by the sensation of water in my ears, cold and whispering. I'd snap awake convinced there was salt drying on my cheeks or blood on my pillow. That sharp electrical feeling stayed in the base of my skull. I haven't gone diving at night since then, and I'm not sure I ever will. Sometimes when the windows are open and the tide is high, I think I hear that soft, deliberate bubbling just outside, balanced, paced, waiting in that perfect triangle. Maybe it's just the plumbing. Maybe it's the ocean, doing what it always does, teasing at the edges of the things we can't see. But even now, months later, I still keep those fragments of blue glass in a jar on my dresser, turning them in the lamplight and tracing the cryptic runes with my thumb. I haven't shown them to anyone else. I can't help but wonder what happened in those lost 30 minutes underwater, and whether what waited in the dark was ever truly behind me, or if it followed me after all. Story number 7. I grew up by Lake Martin, Alabama, on a stilt house with pale green siding that creaked from river winds and the endless damp. The water was always there, visible from every window, always shifting in color or mood. Sometimes gentle, sometimes reptilian and hungry, always loud at night. Life on that water was slow and mostly uneventful. You heard the slap of a carp against the pilings, or some neighbor kid firing bottle rockets. The weirdness, when it came, made less sense because of how ordinary everything else was. It started on an April night, thick with humidity so heavy you could almost swallow it. My brother and I were at the chip formica table under the ceiling fan, slapping cards, sweating so much that even our playing cards bent a little in the middle. Through the open windows, we heard every dog on the bay start howling. Not bark, howling, this drawn, desperate sound that traveled across water and echoed off the cypress knees. The sound made the hair on my arms stand up, but I made a joke about coyotes, and we played another hand instead of looking outside. We both went to bed an hour later, the dogs still yowling into the dark. I fell asleep fast, belly heavy with the heat and boredom, but I woke up in the black heart of the night. The red numbers on my digital clock said 3:47 a.m. I noticed first the quiet. The dogs were silent now, the water still. Then the house started to move. It wasn't wind. Houses in Alabama make noise in wind, but that's the steady hum of nature. This was the sound of the support beams actually flexing, a groan building from beneath as if something had grabbed the whole structure and given it a cautious shake. The air felt charged. My skin prickled. I felt oddly light, as if gravity had let go a bit. I looked out my window expecting to see the neighbor's floodlights bouncing off the wet grass. Instead, I saw the stars, but not as pinholes in a static sky. They were swirling, like someone stirring cream into black coffee, tracing impossible spirals, dragging light itself in lines and arcs I couldn't follow. No clouds, no trees, not even the lake, just the wheeling cosmos, much too close. Panic hadn't set in yet. I was standing up, trying to make sense. That's when the windows started banging open and shut. Not all at once, but rhythmic and rolling, as if a wave of invisible pressure was circling the house, testing it, the way you might tap on a watermelon to hear if it was sound. I staggered to the window, expecting storm winds, but there was no wind. The branches outside hung limp. When I looked down, I nearly hit my lamp. It was wrong. Our house, our home, wasn't sitting above the dark water anymore. The stilt legs cast no reflection. Underneath was a grayish nothing, deeper than water, swirling. I was so high up it made my stomach roll. Beside us, as real as the iron sink behind me, floated a thing. It was shaped like a man's bad dream of a tugboat, metal and wrong in its size and angles, covered in blinking things and half-lit portholes. It didn't hover or float exactly. It just was, sidling up to us like a predator. Behind its shining surface, I saw faces. Not people exactly, just the suggestion of faces, crowded together, eyes glowing red and blue in the shadow, peering out. The glows moved, tracking me, enormous and expressionless. I was outside for a heartbeat. I tasted metal, cold as a coin, and for a moment the whole world was silent except for my pulse. There was a whine, far off, rising in pitch, so high it rattled in my molars. Then I woke up in my bed. The sunlight slanted gold across my pillow. The clock read 6:46 a.m., and I was still in yesterday's t-shirt, sweat dry and sticky on my back. For a moment, nothing seemed wrong, except I was exhausted and cold, my mouth full of sour morning taste. Then as I pushed myself upright, I saw dark half circles on my skin. Bruises, almost perfectly oval, raised and ugly, clustered along my ribs and lower stomach. They didn't hurt exactly, but the feeling made me dizzy. When I ran a hand through my hair, I noticed my nails. Under each one was black, gritty mud. Not clay, not dirt from the bank, but something grainier, full of tiny shell fragments, smelling of deep rot. But the wood floor around my bed was spotless. No tracks, no streaks, nothing on my shoes, just the mud under my nails. Breakfast was tense. My brother teased me for looking like hell. I tried to show my dad the bruises, but he barely glanced, said it was probably sleepwalking in dreams. Maybe I'd rolled out on the deck a bit and got banged up, except the doors were locked from inside. No footprints anywhere, and the mud was gone from my nails before I remembered to show him. I was left with just the memory of the taste in my mouth and the bruises that hung on for 2 weeks after. For months, I couldn't sleep without keeping every lamp and flashlight burning, listening through the thin walls for that first creak or the dogs howling in the distance again. I tried to think about it sensibly. Maybe it was sleep paralysis and dreaming combined. Maybe the summer vapors off the lake had warped my sense of space, or the lightning bugs outside made the stars seem to swirl. Maybe the bruises came from a restless night of half-awake pacing, scraping myself in small, unremembered accidents. But that doesn't account for the way the world felt wrong in those hours. The suffocating awareness, like someone pressing their face against the windows. Sometimes, if I close my eyes on humid nights, I can still see the stars moving, drifting sideways, screwing logic right out of the sky. I can remember the weightlessness and the feeling that some part of the lake, or the night, or the sky itself was watching. I can never quite convince myself it was just a dream, that nothing happened at all. And some nights, when the air is still and the frogs are silent, I wait for the dogs to start howling again, and I wonder, if I look out, what will I see?